The topic of chunking is important, and we need to spend a few more minutes talking about it and see what other options we have there. So we talk about the way to chunk it based on characters and tokens and sentences or paragraphs. We saw the example of the notebook with the semantic chunking, which is very popular. But we also started to talk about how do we add the context of the document. Once we split it into smaller chunks, we might lose important information from the overall document. We saw in the previous example how we can add a title to the chunk. It's a simple way to make sure that we don't lose the context altogether. So we can have it as part of the metadata. We saw the links that we can have for the previous and next document or the section that the chunk is part of. But we can also use LLM for that. In the next example, we're going to see how we can take the chunk, send the document, and how we can generate a short summary of the chunk in the context of the overall document and concatenate the two into the chunk itself. So the encoding of the chunk and the context will be richer and more relevant. We should also talk a bit about what happens if your document might have diagrams and mathematical equations and tables and charts and this kind of a mixed media. In this sense, we can use the LLM as we saw before, but remember that if your documents might have this information, you can have this as part of the encoding. Therefore, you can retrieve those parts, those chunks of the document and send them to the generation. The generation model can benefit from that and use that whether to create an answer or to embed it in its answer. The overall theme of this course is that you can use LLM in multiple places. So it's not only the generation and the encoding, you can have different models in each one of them, and you can add LLM for the enrichment like we do now, the re-ranking that we will do later, and so on. So the ability to add LLM to the flow of your RAG application, different models that some of them you can fine-tune, some of them you can pick and select based on the use case, will make sure that the application works much better. So to summarize the chunking module, we have multiple methods. We talked about the fixed length, semantic or paragraph-based chunking, which are simpler and faster to calculate. And we can have the sliding windows to have overlaps. So the encoding can capture the semantic of the sentence and its surrounding. We saw the example of the semantic chunking. It's highlighted here because it's quite popular and very powerful, very scalable. So it can process much more complicated documents than the simple one that we can do with a simpler method above. We saw the recursive chunking that try to see the document's overall hierarchy and split it in the best way. We saw in the visualization how the output is better this way. The next example we're going to see is the context enrichment. We take the chunks and we enrich them with the overall document context. It's good for long documents that have multiple aspects, but still you want to have the overall context to make sure that you retrieve the relevant part when the query comes. We saw some examples of multimodal, tables, images, charts, and so on. If your documents have this mixed media, you need to have the option to encode it. It can be done by sending to the LLM the mixed media and ask it to describe it, and then use it for the encoding. Remember that the generation model might be more powerful and can handle multimodal, but if you don't have it in the retrieval part, you won't going to get those chunks. And the last option, going back to the theme, that you can have LLM to do many of the parts here, not just to apply some kind of an algorithm. You will send the document to the LLM and ask it, please split this document into chunks. Make sure that the chunks are not shorter than 100 tokens and not longer than 500 tokens. Keep the semantic relevancy and so on. So you can use in your prompt a lot of the instructions that you might otherwise put as parameters into any of the other algorithms and let the LLM do the splitting for you. So now let's go and check the next example of how you can enrich your chunks.